Hi, everyone. Welcome to LSD and the Mind of the Universe with author Chris Bache. The format of this meeting is going to go as follows. I'm going to introduce everyone. Then we're going to have a Q&A. And as John said, just put your question in the chat. Let us know who it's directed to, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. Our panel, Teresa and David, have some questions that are going to be asked first, and that will basically be the format. So I have the honor to introduce Chris Bache. We are so happy he is here with us today. He's here from North Carolina. He is a professor emeritus in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Youngstown State University, where he taught for 33 years. He is also adjunct faculty at the California Institute of Integral Studies, Emeritus Fellow at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and on the advisory board of the Groff Legacy Training. Chris's passion has been the study of philosophical implications of non-ordinary states of consciousness, especially psychedelic states. An award-winning teacher, an international speaker, he has written 4 books. Life Cycles, a study of reincarnation in light of contemporary consciousness research. Dark Night, Early Dawn, a pioneering work in psychedelic philosophy and collective consciousness. The Living Classroom, an explanation of collective fields of consciousness and teaching, and LSD and the Mind of the Universe, the story of his 20-year journey with LSD. Chris is a father of 3, a Vajrayana practitioner, and lives in Weaverville, North Carolina. Welcome, Chris, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Donna. It's my pleasure. And thank you, everyone, for spending part of your Sunday with me. It's a pleasure to be here, a pleasure to talk about these things, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion that follows my comments here. So let me first shift us into share screen so I can throw this PowerPoint up, and people can let me know if this is coming through correctly. John, we looking good?
Okay. We are looking good.
Good. All right. What I'd like to do today is simply take you into some of the highlights. It's kind of a highlight reel of my book, LSD and the Mind of the Universe. As Donna mentioned, I've written 4 books, but all of them come out of my psychedelic work. And all of them, and this book summarizes the entire trajectory of my 20-year journey working with LSD. I consider it probably the most important book I will write in my life. And it's an honor to share it with you here today. So let me give you some background. When I came out of graduate school in 1978, I was a philosopher of religion and kind of an atheistically inclined agnostic, and I was looking for where to take my research next. And it was at that juncture that I met the work of Stanislav Grof. Let me get my picture out of here a little bit, of Stan Grof. And this book changed the course of my life. All right, come on, get to me. Here we go. Here we go. These 2 books, Realms of the Human Unconscious, which Stan had just published 2 years before, and LSD Psychotherapy, his manual on conducting psychedelic sessions. I immediately saw not only the psychological significance of Stan's work, but the philosophical significance to actually be able to explore experientially the deep states of consciousness that allow us to experience the deep structure of the universe itself. That immediately I recognize had profound philosophical significance. So what I did was to split my life in half. During my day job, I continued to teach at the university. I was teaching in a department of philosophy and religious studies, doing the things that professors do. And in my nighttime job, I began a 20-year journey working in Stan Grof's protocols with high doses of LSD, recording all my experiences systematically. That's the backstory to the book. Now, as you know, in Stan's work, he differentiates clearly between low-dose psycholytic therapy and high-dose psychedelic therapy. Low dose, maybe up to 100 sessions, unfolding the mind gradually layer by layer. Psychedelic therapy, limited to 3 sessions, designed to trigger something approximating a near-death episode experience for people who are facing death. So after 3 introductory sessions, medium dose sessions, what I eventually chose was to work in the high dose psychedelic therapy protocol. I eventually did a total of 73 high dose sessions, and I tried to be as systematic and rigorous as I could. I followed the same protocol in all these sessions, the same set and setting, same sitter, same substance, same dose level, same recording process, and even the same location, working in Northeast Ohio. I mention that because, as you know, sometimes the setting in which we do our work can influence the nature of the experiences itself. So this was a long, sustained inquiry into the deep structure of consciousness and the universe. Now, I saw myself at the time simply doing an extended course of psychedelic therapy. But when I got to the end of my journey and I was looking back, I realized that this was more than simply psychedelic therapy, that I was encountering phenomena and dealing with challenges that were not being addressed or had not been addressed in the psychedelic therapy literature. And so eventually I named this particular protocol Psychedelic Exploration. The protocol, the methodology is that of psychedelic therapy, working in isolation, protected with a sitter, eye shades, headphones, the whole 9 yards, the usual thing. The difference is the number of sessions. The high number of sessions turns this into something more than therapy, into an exploration of the deep structure of the universe. So, of course, there are many uses for psychedelics. We use psychedelics for many different purposes, for recreational purposes or to augment creativity. Let me mention just 3 purposes that stand out in my world. One of them is, of course, therapeutic healing, as this picture from MAP shows, which is generating so much attention in the literature and so much important attention in this new renaissance. The second use is for spiritual awakening, as we see reflected in this dialogue between the Buddhist community and the psychedelic community, Zigzag Zen. The use of psychedelics to facilitate a spiritual awakening into one's deeper essential nature. And this is actually why I got started in psychedelics myself, was to accelerate my own spiritual transformation process. The third is cosmological exploration, and this is what my journey turned into. Cosmological exploration, and by this I mean not simply collecting insights that arise whenever we open in a psychedelic state, as always happens, but the systematic pushing the boundaries of consciousness again and again, and entering into deeper and deeper communion with the consciousness that lies within and behind the universe itself. I kept detailed, careful notes of all my sessions, writing up every session within 24 hours, tracked the dates of my sessions, of course, even looked at the astrological variables of my sessions, exploring correlations that Stan and Richard Tarnas have proposed. Now, a few more introductory comments before we jump into the book itself. The story that I'm telling in LSD the Mind of the Universe is not primarily a personal story. It's primarily a cosmological story. I found that this series of sine waves represents a series of psychedelic sessions, which I've drawn overlapping in order to emphasize the continuity that runs between our sessions. I found that insights into my personal life tended to arise in the beginning and endings of my sessions, when I was leaving and and coming back to time-space reality. Working in this modality, and I worked at 500 to 600 micrograms, which, as I explain in the book, is a protocol that I don't recommend. Working at such high dose levels, when I was in my peak hours of my sessions, I was usually operating far beyond my personal reality, at least after the first 10 sessions or so. So sometimes an entire session was given over to personal healing, and sometimes I would be shown certain correlations between what I was seeing and what I in my own personal life. But for the most part, when I was in my sessions, I was operating at a state of consciousness that far outside my personal consciousness. And when I've written down my experiences, unmute.
Hold on, Chris, you're muted. Hold on one moment.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. I actually filtered out a lot of my personal experiences or experiences of personal healing because I did not consider them primarily important to the story I wanted to tell. If you're writing about therapeutic psychedelic use, then your personal experiences are, of course, absolutely essential. But I was really functioning as a philosopher of consciousness. I wanted to explore the deep structure of consciousness. All of us have a story. All of us have a personal story. But this personal story tends to fall away the deeper one enters into the cosmological journey. Now, I found that, let me get some reason I'm losing contact. Oop, yeah, let me back up just a second. I found that there was a continuity between my sessions, that one session tended to start to end, and the next one would start exactly where the previous one had ended, more or less, with some varying degrees of overlap. And in that process, I found that I went through not one, but a series of death rebirths experiences. In this graph, everything below the line is time-space reality and our consciousness functioning in time-space reality. Above the line is transpersonal consciousness when we enter spiritual reality. And of course, when one makes this transition from time-space consciousness to spiritual consciousness, one goes through an ego death experience, which Alex Gray has illustrated so powerfully in this picture, which I like very much. A complete loss, a complete destruction of one's individual, ordinary, conscious identity. What I found on my journey was that as I continued to press the limits of my consciousness, I went through not just one type of death rebirth experience at the egoic level, but a series of death rebirth experiences. And I began to understand that death and rebirth is a cycle that repeats itself as you enter deeper and deeper levels of consciousness. And if we use the vocabulary that Stan uses as we enter psychic, subtle, and causal levels of consciousness. Now, I don't have any vested interest in any particular metaphysical ladder or description of these deeper states of consciousness. In my experience, the universe is infinitely deep. One can enter hundreds of levels of consciousness. This is simply the articulation of a principle that as we stabilize consciousness at one level, when we go deeper, we have to go through yet another cycle of complete surrender in order to enter into the initiation that's possible at this deeper level of consciousness. In some ways, working particularly with high doses of LSD has been compared to a nuclear bomb. The nuclear bomb was created in the same decade that LSD was created. But a long, sustained series of psychedelic experiences focused in a therapeutic modality triggers, as it were, a sustained nuclear explosion, not only destructuring reality as you have known it, but introducing you into deeper and deeper levels of reality. The way this nuclear explosion exposes deeper levels of the atmosphere that were always there, but had been invisible until this nuclear explosion brought them into our awareness. Now, we're not talking about nuclear bombs, of course. We're talking about this beautiful universe that we are part of. 100 billion galaxies, billions of stars in our own Milky Way galaxy. So I'd like to use this picture now as the backdrop to talk about some of the turning points on my journey and some of the levels of reality I entered. When I was looking back over the whole of my journey and trying to create the structure for the telling of the story, I identified 5 core levels of consciousness or core cycles of death and rebirth that I went through. One, having to do at the level of personal mind, personal consciousness. The second, collective mind, or the species mind. The third, archetypal mind. The fourth, operating at the level of causal oneness, or the one. And the fifth, diamond luminosity. So this is the organization I used in actually creating the travelogue that's in the book. So let me back up and simply pull out the chapters or take you through the book, identifying the sequence of the experiences. Can't talk about them very much in the brief time we have, but just give you some signposts. The chapter dealing with personal mind is the chapter 2, Crossing the Boundary of Birth and Death. This is, in my experience, this was like classic perinatal death rebirth process. I felt like a poster boy for Stan Grof's description of the perinatal process. Very intense convulsions, very intense confrontations with the meaninglessness of life, with the limits of existence. Eventually, after, in the course of 2 years and 10 sessions, coming to a point where the universe just snapped me like a twig. It just basically broke me in half. And it did that by forcing me to become the exact opposite of everything that I had known myself to be. I entered this work as a male, white male, academic, passionately interested in the meaning of life. I became the exact opposite of that. I became hundreds of women, women of color, women who have no interest in philosophical inquiry at all. It was a terrifying ordeal. And when I let go and I surrendered to that ordeal, I was then flipped into the positive side of women's experiences and taken on the most extraordinary journey of women's experiences under the arm of the Great Mother. Now, I believe in reincarnation. I believe we all have had lives as men and women, but this wasn't simply an encounter with my previous lives as women. The message here was not embrace your former lives. The message was, where you are going, gender does not exist. Let go. And when I let go of my identity as Chris Bache, as I had known myself, I entered into the beginnings of a deep conversation with the universe, a deep communion with the universe. And I thought, after having gone through this very deep ego death, that my suffering was over, and now that I would just be introduced to a banquet of cosmological insights. But that's not what happened. At the level of collective mind, there's several chapters here. Now, I divide my sessions divided themselves into 2 halves, a purifying stage, or a cleansing stage, and an ecstatic stage. In the sessions in the 2 years following crossing the boundary of birth and death, in the purifying stage, I began to enter levels of of reality that involved hundreds of thousands of people, thousands and thousands of years, a vast domain of terrible anguish and suffering and violence. I was brought back into this domain consistently and taken deeper and deeper into it. At first, I thought this represented a deepening of my ego death, but this went on for so long, and it involved so many people in such excruciating detail that eventually I came to a different conclusion. And the conclusion was that somehow in my sessions, my personal reality, sort of my personal transformation, had been exchanged or had been surrendered and became a process of collective transformation. That the healing that was taking place and the uncovering of trauma that was taking place was not about my personal healing and not about my personal trauma, but was about collective healing, the healing that our species has collected over its thousands and thousands of years of history. When I went into the ecstatic portion of these same sessions, I entered in what I called deep time in the chapter Deep Time in the Soul. For 1 year, I had a repeated experience, 7 sessions of experiencing my life from start to finish, beginning to end, as a simultaneous present. I experienced the beginning of my life, the end of my life, all the middle of my life as a completed whole, as something yet to be and something that was already complete. When I first entered deep time, it was an extraordinarily powerful and moving experience to me. And yet when I came out of the session, I lost it. I couldn't remember it. But what I found was that by going back into the same state of consciousness again and again, my experiences in those states got clearer. My recall got more complete. I was learning how to stay awake, stay conscious inside deep time. And this is an important epistemological point. When you systematically enter states of consciousness that are so far removed from anything we know inside time and space, it's very hard to bring back all our experiences intact. But if you go back to the same state of consciousness with rigor and discipline, eventually your consciousness adapts to the unusual conditions and you learn how to stay awake in states of awareness that previously had simply swallowed you. And this repeats itself, or in my experience, it repeated myself over and over and over again. When I would break into a new state of consciousness, it was very hard to retain everything that I had encountered. But with repetition, my recall got stronger. Now, quick, just a side comment. In my 20-year journey, I worked for 4 years. I stopped for 6 years for reasons given in the book, and then I resumed for a very intense 10 years. This is where my journey stopped after 4 years. And then I took a 6-year hiatus. And when I began, this is reported in the chapter Initiation into the Universe. When I began, the ocean of suffering began exactly where it had stopped 6 years before, without missing a beat. And it continued to deepen and deepen and deepen in intensity. Meanwhile, in the ecstatic portion of the session, I was taken into an extraordinary journey into the universe, completely transcending anything to do with my personal life. That was over. Now it was as if the consciousness guiding my sessions was giving me a crash course in Cosmology 101. Now I give names to all my sessions. I give names, I take notes, I break them down into bullet points. When I see the name, it brings the entire session to mind. My goal as a philosopher is to hold my entire journey in my mind at the same time. So the names of the sessions that I address in this chapter are as follows. All of these were operating at the subtle level of consciousness, beyond the psychic level of consciousness. They were all taking me deep into this learning about how the universe is put together. The master plan was an initiation into some of the core themes of humanity's evolution, and I'm going to come back to this later. Eventually, the ocean of suffering culminated in session 24, Healing the Collected Womb. The suffering that I was absorbed into reached unprecedented levels, and then it culminated in this orgy of healing this collective pain, and then it disappeared. And the collective pain, the ocean of suffering, never reappeared in any subsequent session. We then went on to the next level of work. And the next level of work for me involved an encounter that took place at the archetypal level of consciousness. In the chapter, The Greater Real of Archetypal Reality. So much that I could say here, trying to keep it short so we can go into the questions and answers soon. I found that basically I could break down my experiences here between two levels. One level taking place at the high subtle level, at the what you might call Platonic level of consciousness, in which I experience archetypes that lay far, far beyond time and space, but they were not archetypes as Plato described them. Plato describes archetypes as unchanging eternal ideas in the mind of an eternal deity. I experienced archetypes as vast living processes, so radically beyond anything we know of inside time and space, anything I had known of, that I literally could not wrap my mind around them. The closest I could come to seeing them in any coherent way was I saw them as galaxies, which was simply the best my mind could do to approximate them. They were operating in a different order of time, a different order of intentionality, and these were the constitutive forces that were responsible for creating time and space and creating the reality that was unfolding inside time and space. At a lower subtle level, also at the archetypal level, I entered what you might think of as a Jungian level of consciousness, where I had repeated experiences of the universe, of this mind of our species, operating as a single whole, one mind of the entire species. And I was given repeated lessons in how this works. How is it that each of our individual minds are fractal aspects of the mind of the species? How our individual karma is part of our collective karma. I began to have experiences at this level of collective reincarnation. That is, I began to have experiences of the entire species incarnating generation by generation as a single unified whole. Previously, I had thought of reincarnation in terms of the story of the individual soul, the story of all of our individual souls choosing individual lives for our individual development. But here, all this dissolved into an experience of the entire species as a single organism evolving itself through a deep, profound collective process, and all of our individual lives were fractal aspects of this deep collective process. The magnitude of what I was seeing completely reframed my understanding of the intelligence operating inside the universe and in our own evolution. These are the sessions which I address in this chapter. And I'd like to point out how much cleansing is involved, even at this high archetypal level. Session 28, The Fever is Broken, was a very high, my first encounter with causal reality, very pure celestial state of awareness, after which I was plunged into 3 grueling sessions of just excruciating purification. Took me a long time to understand what was happening here, but eventually I began to understand the following: that every step, every deeper level of reality functions at a higher level of energy. And when you break through to a deeper level of reality, your entire psychophysical system has to go through a purification process that will allow you to handle the enormous flows of energy that are operating at that higher level of reality. This repeated itself again and again after I would have a major breakthrough into a new level of reality. The following session was always kind of a carrying out the garbage session. It was always a session of deep cleansing, so much so that I began to dread the session following a major breakthrough session. Again, this is an insight that's important. If you touch a deep state of consciousness very briefly, this may not manifest itself. But if your goal is to have sustained awareness at a particular level of reality, then you must go through this cleansing ordeal. Otherwise, your experiences at that deeper level will be fragmented and you won't be able to bring back a coherent story. After moving into archetypal reality, I then went into what I came to understand as causal reality, causal oneness. It was an extraordinary year of blessings, one blessing after another. The 4 sessions that I address in this chapter are these. The forest was an experience of shunyata, what the Buddhists call shunyata, emptiness of self, profound transparency, no self in me, no self anywhere in the world, experience the world as a manifestation of diversity, but complete interpenetration and no separate self anywhere in existence. Singing the universal way was an experience that culminated in an experience of the void, the fertile void, out of which all existence springs. Jesus's blood was an experience of profound cosmic love, love unlike anything I had ever experienced up to this point in time. The birth of the diamond soul, let me just linger there for just a second. The traditional teaching of reincarnation, this was about reincarnation. The traditional teaching here is that when we achieve a certain state of spiritual maturity, we awaken to our spiritual essence. And at that point, then we leave time and space. The Hindus call awakening, spiritual awakening, moksha, to escape samsara, to escape cyclic existence. When one reaches spiritual maturity, one then transcends time and space. You can leave samsara, you can enter the pure land, you can enter the garden or enter heaven. In this experience, in session 38, I was given a very different model of reincarnation. I began to experience all my former lives coming into me very quickly, and it was like wrapping a filament of white light around a kite spool. And at some point, all these lives fused, and there was a huge energy generated, and it catapulted me into a state of consciousness beyond any that I had experienced up to that time. I was both an individual, but I was an individual beyond any frame of reference that I had imagined previously. And I came to understand when this happened, there was an explosion of diamond light from my chest. And I was given a series of teachings that this is where reincarnation is taking humanity. We're not simply growing incrementally, lifetime by lifetime, year by year, century by century, making incremental improvements in our developmental sequence, becoming more bit by bit, actualizing our innate potential. Eventually, we come to a point where all of our former lives merge. We experience our soul. Now, I think this happens when we die and we return to spirituality, but the birth of the diamond soul is the birth of soul consciousness inside our physical incarnation. I think that humanity is evolving in a direction where eventually every human being born will be born not into a contracted egoic consciousness, contracted into our time-space person, but every human being will be born as a soul, more conscious, fully conscious of their past and in a much deeper communion with surrounding spiritual reality. From here, my sessions took me next into the Diamond Luminosity material in the chapter called Diamond Luminosity. Now, this chapter covers 26 sessions and 4 years of work. And in those 4 years, I entered this state, which I call Diamond Luminosity, 4 times, and only 4 times. I entered a state of reality that was beyond anything I had previously touched. It was exceptionally clear, luminous reality. I had touched light many times before. I had been taken into light many times before, but this was a higher order of light than any I had previously known. And when I call this light the diamond luminosity, I'm not simply using a metaphor to describe the light. I'm trying to describe a particular register of light, a particular quality of light. I've learned that light has many, many levels to it. There are many gradations of light. And this was an exceptionally pure state of luminous awareness. I think that this is what the Buddhists would call Dharmakaya, the clear light of absolute reality. In between these 4 immersions, there were, as you might guess, repeated episodes of deep cleansing, profound purification, many personal healings, and then coming back into these states of hyper clarity. So much more that I'd like to say here, but we'll let it stop here and move on. The 9th chapter. And I wish I had written the book and put it in this order, because this is the order it really belongs. One of the recurring themes that kept coming up in all of my work, going all the way back to the chapter on the initiation into the universe, was this master story of humanity. I kept being taken into the deep future and being taken into the deep structural evolutionary process underpinning history. And I kept being given a series of visions about where humanity was in its evolution and where we were going. And what I've done in the book is I've pulled all these bits and pieces, rather than address them bit by bit, I've pulled them together and presented it into this one chapter, The Birth of the Future Human. And let me say that when I began this work, I never imagined that I would be talking about the birth of the future human. I thought of this work as personal transformation, personal awakening. And yet I think that this chapter may be the most important chapter of the book, because if the visions shared here are true, they concerned my children, my grandchildren, your grandchildren, all of the children of our grandchildren. The vision that emerged this here is that humanity is coming to a turning point in its long evolutionary journey, a turning point that will forever change the conditions of life on this planet. Here's the material I address in this chapter. The visions of awakening, I gather all the snippets, the bits and pieces from these sessions that covered over 4 years into a series of 6 visions, which basically are powerful visions that are indicating that the creative intelligence of the universe is trying to awaken the entire species, not simply individuals, but the entire species. Now, for there to be a profound collective awakening, there must be a profound purification. And in session 55, which took place in 1995, I was taken deep into the future. And I apologize for the seemingly absurd nature of this description, but if you've been with me so far, you'll go with me here, I hope. I was taken deep into the future and experienced, not as an individual, but as the human species as a whole, I experienced the death and rebirth of our entire species. I experienced the entire world coming into a profound global systems crisis that seemed to have been generated by a series of global ecological crises. Now, I was not informed on ecology at this time. I was not at all aware of the series of ecological challenges that we are facing, which we are all quite aware of now. This was in 1995, so this is over 25 years ago. And yet I was taken into a future where I experienced humanity being brought to their knees, a radical loss of all the certainties that we live with in life, a complete loss of control, just an absolute life-threatening, species-threatening crisis that went on for years. And yet, just when it was at its worst, just when it seemed as if all was lost, the storm passed. And when the survivors picked themselves up and began to reassemble, they were different. They had been changed profoundly at the core of their being by the intensity of the crisis that we had all gone through. They were different. Their hearts were different. Their minds were different. They began to generate powerful patterns, new patterns of civilization based upon the new values, the new understanding, the new insights that had been awakened in them during this crisis. So much more to say there, but I'll have to stop at that point. The 11th chapter, Final Vision, is the last year of my work, which included one particularly intense session, the most radical strip down that I had gone through in any of my sessions, taking me far, far into the future and giving me a series of experiences of our universe that seemed to be the capstone of everything that had taken place on my journey up to this point in time. I won't try to summarize it here because the clock is relentlessly moving. And the last chapter, which I don't think you can see here, is Coming Off the Mountain, in which I describe what happened when I stopped my journey. Long story, I will say that this was the hardest chapter for me to write. It took me over a year to write this chapter. Because when I stopped my journey, I had been given so many gifts on this journey. I thought that I could simply withdraw and would receive the blessings of all these visions that I had been given. I had been given the gift of a lifetime as a philosopher. But what I found over time was that I was entering into a state of deep existential sadness. As I sat with this and lived with it over time, I realized that I was suffering from a withdrawal of intimate communion with the divine fabric. I eventually reached a point where I realized I was simply waiting to die so that I could return to intimacy with the divine, could dissolve into the divine light again. Because once you've dissolved into the diamond luminosity, time-space can lose its appeal. It took me years, it took me about 10 years to finally consolidate myself back into time-space in a way that allowed me to live contentedly within time and space and the conditions of time-space. And I did so by grabbing my life and focusing myself on living in the physical world and the continued assimilation of the impact or the implications of the visions that I had been given. All my books come out of my psychedelic work. The work on reincarnation comes out of my early work in Deep Time in the Soul. Dark Night, Early Dawn, though it was published after my sessions had ended. I did all this work between 1979 and 1999. I talk about my journey in Dark Night, Early Dawn, but I only talk about the first half of the journey. I really don't talk about the second half. The core theme of Dark Night, Early Dawn is the collective structure of consciousness and the collective import of our transformative practices. And then I wrote a book called The Living Classroom in 2008. And very quickly, the backstory of that book is that even though my students never knew anything about my psychedelic experiences, and I did not talk about my psychedelic work on campus for obvious legal reasons, I found that my students were being impacted by my psychedelic work, that there was a ripple effect, that the deeper I went into the unified fabric of reality, it was as if it was sending ripples of transformation out around me, and my students were being impacted by those ripples. Eventually, I had to study them. I had to really understand more deeply what was taking place, what was happening. And I wrote The Living Classroom, which is about collective consciousness. And I don't mention psychedelics there at all, because the psychedelics are not the issue. The issue is the nature of consciousness itself. And it doesn't make any difference which transformational method you're using. If you go deeply enough into the structure of consciousness, it will have ramifications that will spread out around you in 360 degrees. All of these come out of my psychedelic work, and it is, where we go here? Yeah. LSD in the Mind of the Universe, Diamonds from Heaven really tells the core story of this journey. Thank you very much for letting me describe it to you today.
Thank you so much, Chris. It does tell the story in detail. It's an amazing book. I highly recommend it, especially after hearing this talk. Before we move on to the Q&A, I'd like to introduce our two co-hosts. And one of our co-hosts, Teresa, is going to ask a few questions, but I'm going to give introductions right now. Teresa Marie is a certified coach and speaker on neuroscience and consciousness. She has a master's degree in organizational development from John F. Kennedy University. Teresa has spoken internationally and has a TEDx talk on what the dying can teach the living. Teresa and Dr. David Jackson, an anesthesiologist, co-facilitate psychedelic psychotherapy sessions using ketamine and other psychoactive medicines. David uses his medical, scientific, and problem-solving nature to work with clients to find the right medicine, and Teresa supports clients through the integration work of the medicine. The goal is to make clients conscious of unconscious patterns that keep them in the cycle of depression, anxiety, and addictions so that they can experience personal transformation. Their integrated approach helps clients achieve a more meaningful existence. Teresa, you want to say hello?
Hello, how are you?
Okay, and Dr. David Jackson. Dr. Jackson is an anesthesiologist and functional medicine doctor with his BSEE from Rice University and MD from Southwestern Medical School. David developed his interest in transformative mental wellness and entheogenic treatment of addiction in a family member after 30 plus years of failed conventional therapy. Using his experience with the practice of anesthesiology, Dr. Jackson has developed specific means for mitigation of undesirable effects, pharmacological treatment, while developing compounded therapies tailored for optimal effect, timing, and safety. David emphasizes the importance of interaction with concurrent medications, age, coexisting medical conditions, medical and therapeutic history, precision dosing, chemical purity, and safety through the education of therapists and clients. David partners with Teresa for an integrative approach to transformative therapy for enduring results and offers telemedicine consultation to determine the best advantageous approach to your wellness. Welcome, David.
Hey, thank you, Donna, and thank you, Chris. It was awesome. Thank you.
Okay, at this point, we're going to go to the Q&A, and we're going to start with Teresa.
Great. So Chris, that was an amazing talk and I loved it. And I have to tell everybody, his book is really wonderful, really wonderful. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. So I would love for you, you worked with Stan Groff early on and, you worked with an awful lot of his protocols and things like that. And I know a lot of people will indicate in a lot of ways that, okay, well, can you get to these states of consciousness other than through psychedelics? So how would you compare like holotropic breathwork to your high LSD sessions? Because you've trained with him a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I've not done any of Stan's training in the holotropic breathwork. I mean, Stan as a colleague, and we've been in dialogue and we've been on podiums together. And I consider Stan to be the primary intellectual figure that I've been in dialogue with as I've unfolded my own account. Yes, absolutely. One can enter into these states without using psychedelics. Psychedelics are an amplifier of consciousness. So in the end, it's consciousness that does the work. I've had many people write me after this book has come out and say, I understand what you're saying. I've had many similar experiences myself, and I've never used psychedelics. I'm a lifelong meditator, so on and so forth. As an academic, I've taught courses in comparative mysticism, and I've studied the lives of the great masters, the great spiritual masters who certainly moved into these states and into even deeper states of consciousness. And clearly, all the great masters, all honor to the great masters. They've always been my guides in this process. So yes, one can move into these states without psychedelics. But we're talking about not just a few years of work or even a few decades of work. We're talking about lifetimes and lifetimes of consistently working to push these boundaries. The great spiritual masters have been at this for many lifetimes. My sense is that holotropic breathwork is a very powerful, evocative, amplifier of consciousness. I think it basically, it can evoke states of consciousness equally strong to psychedelic states. I don't think that it would be, I do not have enough experience to truly say this, but my impression is, in talking with many practitioners, that I would think that holotropic breathwork would be able to generate states that are comparable to low or medium dose LSD sessions, but not high dose LSD sessions, not the type of states of consciousness that open in a sustained series of such sessions. But these are points on the continuum. I've had some very, very deep experiences in holotropic breathwork sessions that were certainly in many respects comparable to my psychedelic experiences.
Great, thank you so much. Now, you also talk a lot about the future human, and you talk about kind of that we're going to go through a lot of suffering. Okay, well, most transformation tends to happen in suffering. And it's kind of a shame that it's that way. I always say that, but it propels us on. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of what some of your visions were? Because have some of them come to pass since what you saw in the 90s? Have some of them come to pass, or are you still waiting for some of them to come to pass? Because I think a lot of people are really interested in that.
Yeah. The consistent theme in my sessions was positive, that humanity was coming to a turning point in history, that humanity, after a very, very long evolutionary journey, was coming to a decisive turning point that was changing the course of history, that we're coming to a collective spiritual explosion, and that this was being driven from underneath us. It was a decision made at a cosmological level, driving up underneath us and surfacing in our individual lives that we were cooperating with, but was much larger than simply the act of all of our individual lives. It's really only one particular session where I was taken into the specific conditions of our death and rebirth, our collective death and rebirth. And in that vision, in that session, session 55, I wasn't given any details. I wasn't given any time. I wasn't given any specific experiences of like COVID-19 or anything like that. What I experienced was the entire species of the planet being brought to its collective knees, entering a period of profound compression, profound loss of control, deep, deep existential angst, and just an absolute almost hopelessness, just being overwhelmed by the conditions we were facing. And then in the depth of that, in some ways, a collective death rebirth process, like a collective near extinction event. And in that process, we metamorphized, we changed, we became more than we had been before. Now, in many sessions leading up to that, I was taken into what I think are the nuts and bolts of this. And that nuts and bolts of this are reincarnation. I think that we have been evolving and developing ourselves and becoming more for thousands and thousands of years. And just as gestation is a long, gradual process of development, but birth is a very short, cathartic process. Likewise, human evolution is a long, gradual developmental process, but the birth of the next level of human experience, the next form of humanity, the birth of the future human, which I think will be the birth of the diamond soul in history, that birth process is, relatively speaking, short and cathartic. I don't know how long it will take. I would anticipate that it would take multiple generations. This is an evolutionary pivot that we're making. I have had experiences where I was taken into the future and allowed to experience the future human, experience the archetype of the future human. And those experiences drove me into deep ecstasy. It was some of the most profoundly moving experiences of my journey, because we're talking about a humanity healed of all the scars of history, of all the terrible things that we've done to each other, a humanity with its consciousness open, capable of profound communion with the creative intelligence of the universe. I think we are going through a developmental process. We're coming into the hard part. We're coming into the birth process. And I think it's really important for us to have a vision of what this is all about, because when it starts to get really bad, and I think COVID may be the overture of the symphony of our transformation, it is not itself sufficiently powerful to bring about the events that I experienced in my sessions, but I think it's an overture. It shows us, it's teaching us a lot. It has taught us a lot, if we're paying attention, a lot that can be very helpful when the deeper crises come. And I think the deeper crises are going to be any number of forms of ecological punctuated crises that are going to hit us wave after wave in the decades ahead. Now we're getting a better sense of what's coming at us. We can see it. We've got good maps. Dwayne Elgin's book, Choosing Earth, gives the next 5 decades, breaks it down decade by decade of the challenges we're facing. There are any number of books that are pointing this out to us. So I think we can see what's coming. The challenge is understanding the evolutionary implications of what's coming.
Yeah, I would agree. Thank you. So there was a question in the chat that asked you about when you said the same set and setting each and every time. Can you describe your set and setting for those who have not read your book? I know what the set and setting is, but it would be really helpful for you to explain how that worked in your process.
I do a lot of preparation for every session. I take good care of my body. I make sure that my body is relaxed and clear. I watch my diet particularly. In the day, session day, personally, I would always start in the morning. I start in the early morning with yoga and meditation. I was always working either at home or in my wife's office. My wife then, Carol, was a clinical psychologist. She was my sitter for all of my sessions. All of my sessions were focused on spiritual intention. I found that I tried experimenting with setting an intention for my sessions, but I found that working with doses this high, that basically was irrelevant. My personal intention became irrelevant, so that my intention became one of absolute complete surrender. My prayer was, whatever you need, I give you. Whatever the universe needed from me on that day is what I would give. After the session, I always wrote my sessions up within 24 hours the next day. I developed, the more frequently you go into these states in a sustained manner, the greater the impact is on your subtle energy system. I found that it was really important to do very active spiritual practice, particularly after a session. So later, when I was entering the Diamond Luminosity work, it was during that time that my spiritual practice became more focused on Vajrayana Buddhism. So I do specific practices before a session and different practices after a session. I found that when I began to do these Vajrayana practices, these ancient practices that have very old, morphogenetic fields associated with them, it had a distinct impact on my journey. It really helped facilitate not only the entry into these deep states of consciousness, but it helped me absorb the insights and the energy of the impact with these deep states of consciousness. So a lot of intentionality, and these experiences take a lot out of your body. I mean, these are, huge, you're subjecting yourself to huge tidal waves of energy. So careful preparation, careful focus, and then very careful debrief is absolutely essential.
Chris, you mentioned, didn't you mention that music was a pretty big part of your journeys, at least in the beginning, and the replaying of the music afterwards to help you with your recollections? Did you feel like that's important, or that it was important even at that level, your higher levels later in your sessions?
Yeah, I used music in all of my sessions all the way through, very carefully selected music. We have literature on the theoretical approach to the stages of a session, matching the stages of the session with the music that has qualities that match the stages of sessions. I like never working with music that has English. If there are words at all, it would have words that you couldn't understand. You don't want to trigger familiar associations. I very quickly, after a year or so, I let go of classical music for the most part and used almost exclusively indigenous music. I found that to be much more powerful, evocative for me. When I would write up my sessions, I developed a strategy for improving recall. I would listen to the music that was played in the session in exactly the same order in which it had been played, and I would keep playing the same music over and over again while I was writing up the session until I felt I had captured what had happened during that piece of music. Then I would go to the next piece of music and I would continue the process. I found that playing the music of the session while I was writing up the session allowed me to get a more complete portrait down in print of the session itself, and it really helped improve recall.
Thank you.
Now, I've also done subsequent, after I stopped my high dose LSD work, of course, I've done other sessions since then. Sometimes I've used music, sometimes I haven't used music at all. I understand just opening up without music as well as opening up with music. But for me, working with high doses of LSD, the experiences are so intense, so extreme. I found working with music to be a very helpful adjunct to the opening process.
Great. Thank you. Also, you mentioned in your book too that, of course, your LSD doses were primarily between 500 and 600 micrograms, correct?
Mhm. Yes.
Yes. Yes. And then you mentioned after you, of course, you had that downregulated where you connected with the divine and you felt the oneness of everything and that amazing consciousness state. And then to come back down here to this state and this everyday being can be a little disappointing. And you'd mentioned that you had tried other psychedelic medicines, and someone had asked, in the chat, I know you said you tried ayahuasca and psilocybin, but you didn't feel like they were as powerful as LSD in your journey. Can you express a little bit as to, why you feel like that was the case?
Well, there are many, many psychedelics, of course, thousands of synthetic psychedelics, hundreds of organic psychedelics. My sense is that each psychedelic, while having the common feature of opening consciousness, amplifying consciousness, each psychedelic has a particular set of qualities and has a potential to activate a certain range of consciousness. Serial usage over multiple sessions can deepen that range, but there's basically a certain range and a certain quality. I experience LSD as being kind of what I would call a high ceiling psychedelic. It tends to push the cosmological ceiling, whereas psilocybin tends to be much more body grounded, emotionally saturated, tuning to our physical body, tuning to our emotional body. It has ceiling, but my experience of it is it tends to be a much more of kind of an embodied open state rather than a potentially disembodied open state or far from bodied open state. Ayahuasca, I've had limited experience with, but it seems to me similar in that way, very closely integrated with the body, with the emotional body. It has more headroom in my experience than psilocybin does, though I have only initial preliminary experience with that. I have had some experience with 5-MeO-DMT, very different psychedelic, very potentially profound catapulting psychedelic. The challenge with that particularly is, of course, it's so short acting, and that opens up a whole nother area of discussion, short acting psychedelics versus long acting psychedelics. And I discuss this in the book. I think there are certain advantages. There are clearly disadvantages to the hassle of a long acting psychedelic, but there are some advantages. It does allow the kind of sustained contact with these deep non-ordinary states that leads to a purification of the mind doing the exploration. Short acting psychedelics don't give you as large a window to be changed and transformed by the dimensions of consciousness that you're contacting. This was Richard Strassman's observations from his work with DMT. He found, much to his surprise, that while many of his subjects had profound experiences on DMT, it did not result in very lasting change to their personality structure. And he thought it was because it's very short acting. It's the window which is important, which is significant here.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think what I did in my work was to drill an unusually deep borehole into the universe, but there's so much that I didn't see, so much which these other substances revealed to us, which I did not experience. I mean, psilocybin and ayahuasca connect us to the elemental world. They connect us to the world of spirit. They connect us to all the levels of intelligence that kind of live close to and saturate time-space reality. So many, many levels that I did not particularly engage or touch.
Okay, thank you. So I know we have some questions in the chat. So David, do you want to address some of the questions in the chat?
Yeah, one moment here. Teresa. Thank you. Let's see.
That was a beautiful answer, Chris. I just want to say that was just so well said. And I've got a question, or John Hock's got a question, actually. David, while you look, why don't we let John ask his question?
Oh, bet. Go ahead, John.
couple quick ones, actually. Well, this first one may not be quick. I asked Stan Groff at one point directly if there was anything that he could correlate a difficult trip with. And he said his work with Tarnas and his own work turned up that a hard transit to Mars, to natal Mars, was the only thing he could point to that would predict a difficult trip. And at the time, he was still working with Rick to go further. Now, I find it fascinating that you charted correlations while you were doing your journeys. And I'm wondering specifically if you've come, what sort of what things have correlated astrologically, and specifically, has there been something that would correlate to a breakthrough, to moving to a higher level?
Yeah, good question, and a complicated question. I'm aware of, and Rick Tarnas is a good friend, as is Stan, and I'm aware of Stan's writing and his analysis of certain cases and the astrological correlations of certain people going through breakthroughs. I'm aware of the proposal that the outer planets correlating with the perinatal matrices seem to be somewhat predictive of the patterns of oppression, contraction, breakthrough, and liberation in people's experiences. I've looked at these correlations in my own work, and on the one, and first of all, I completely accept the proposal that they've made. I understand it. I think that makes sense. The intelligence of the universe that I experience, it makes intuitive sense that the rhythm of the universe would be part of the rhythm of this intelligence, and that as we open up beyond personal psyche, that there would be this kind of this solar system pulse to the nature of our experiences. That said, I have not found correlations to be as striking as I had expected. And I have found that as my work deepened over the years, that I could not correlate breakthroughs and impasses with astrological variables as much as I had expected to do. And so that led me to formulate a hypothesis, and I call it the roll-off hypothesis. And that is, in the early stages of our work, or when we're working at lower doses, or in earlier stages when our time-space identity is being unfolded and impacted, I think there'd be stronger correlations between our natal transits, the transits to our natal chart, or even our global transits. But as one's work deepens, when you begin to go into and beyond archetypal reality, when you're going beyond time and space and deep into the universe, I think that there is a roll-off effect of the planetary correlates to experience. At least I found that the dynamic relationship with the universe, the way the universe crushed me and kissed me and drew me out and melted me into herself, did not seem to correlate tightly with specific planetary correlations. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. So I think there is a roll-off effect. My proposal is that there's a roll-off effect of astrological import. Now, this is an open question. I'm not an astrologer. This is something I'm interested in. It's an active dialogue between Richard Tarnas and myself about this issue. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
And this is why in my book, I actually put the dates of all of my sessions, and I give my birth information, because I would like to encourage this discussion of the correlations between astrology and our own psychedelic experiences.
Thank you very much. So excellent, excellent answer. And your hypothesis makes an awful lot of sense. I'm going to stop my questions now and let other people open it up for other people. There's a number of very good questions in the chat. So,
David, did you have one, or Teresa?
Well, Rachel had a really good question. I don't know if she wants to ask it herself, but she wanted to speak a little bit more about how your consciousness work has changed and affected your life over the time in your physical essence right now. In other words, how has that been transformative in your life?
Good question. Hard question to answer. And I'll tell you one of the things that really complicated things in my particular instance. And the thing that complicated it was that I wasn't allowed to talk about my work. I mean, I'm a teacher. I love to teach. I love to learn and share what I've learned. I'm a philosopher, and yet our psychedelic phobic culture did not allow me or give me any platform to bring the deepest philosophical experiences of my life forward and mind them with my students or with my colleagues to extract their philosophical potential. So that when I stopped my sessions, the deep sadness I entered was not simply a sadness that came from withdrawing from the cosmological communion, but it was a sickness which was generated by silence. I have not been allowed to talk about this work publicly. And as I wrote the book, I began to experience a number of changes taking place. And as I began to speak about the book, these changes have deepened. I found my sessions beginning to, as it were, come together and into a larger aggregates, into a larger whole. As I began to own my sessions, to own my psychedelic history and come out of the psychedelic closet, these sessions began, as it were, to saturate me and soak into me at deeper and deeper levels. And this process is still continuing. I don't know where it will go. I wish I could say, wow, I've touched the oneness of the universe and I live in perpetual oneness all the time. You know, I live in this state of ecstatic joy all the time, but it's not like that. I think that going into these temporary states, and it's really important these are temporary states. These are not the same, they don't have the same impact as touching these realities after 30 years of contemplative practice on the top of a mountain. It's not the same thing. These are temporary immersions which are genuine, and you can't abide in these states simply when you come back, when you're done, even if you've done all your homework carefully, and even if you attend to integration very conscientiously. But they change the trajectory of your evolution. They change the trajectory of your soul's development. I live with an understanding of reality that allows me to open into a prayerful engagement of reality, which is certainly different than I had in the beginning of this journey. And I think that late in my sessions, or at the end of my journey, Spirit said to me two things. It said 20 years in, 20 years out, meaning it would take at least 20 years to assimilate 20 years of journeying. And I think now, I thought at the time, that sounds about right. Now I'm thinking that might have been optimistic. I literally think the things that I've touched will be unfolding over many lifetimes, not simply one lifetime, but it's changed the trajectory of the evolution of my soul. The other thing it said to me is, there's the dying of seeing and the dying of keeping. The dying of seeing is the death and rebirth process you go to when you're being initiated into the deep structure of the universe. The dying of keeping is what you do when you are in your ordinary state of consciousness back inside time and space in order to let those experiences enter into and saturate you deeper, more and more deeply into your daily life. My practice these days is primarily contemplative practice, Buddhist Vajrayana practice. I'm basically kind of sitting still and letting the universe come to me here rather than going out to meet it there.
Thank you. So I know, Donna, you said there were a couple more questions in the chat you thought were good.
I do, yeah. Andrew has a question for Chris, and Chris, none of these are going to be easy just because of the nature of your work. How has your understanding of the future human changed or been reinforced since first experiencing it in the late 90s? to the writing of this book to the present day?
It hasn't changed one bit. I say in the book that when I had the experience of session 55, the death and rebirth of humanity in 1995, for weeks I walked around like I was walking around Hiroshima a week before the bomb went off. I have carried in my being, in my body, a knowing of where we are in history and what's coming. And when I look around, everyone around me, whether I agree with them politically or socially or not, I look at them and I see heroes. I see every human being who is here on this planet has incarnated voluntarily, has chosen to be part of this evolutionary pivot. Every person here, even though they may not remember it at all, has chosen to be here. And this is going to be a very, very difficult period to incarnate. And the beings who are part of this incarnation process are just extraordinarily powerful, valuable beings. Nothing has changed. It's been interesting to watch COVID. It's been interesting to watch ecological awareness begin to grow and ferment. And frankly, things are coming to a head or happening faster than I had expected. I expect this decade, if everything the scientists are telling us, this decade is the last window we have to change the trajectory of what's coming at us. But if the past is an indication, we're not going to change as radically as we need to change to avert this trauma. And so I expect the patterns of trauma to intensify in the decades and decades coming. This century is going to be an extraordinary ordeal. It is going to be the dark night of our collective soul. But the dark night of the soul is, of course, a process of profound purification. And we as a species are purifying ourselves extraordinarily rapidly. We're purifying ourselves of all the decisions we've made in history, of all the choices we've made in the past, our choices on how to treat each other, our choices on how to treat animals, our choices on how to treat the planet itself. All of these choices are kind of coming at us very, very fast and very, very deeply. This is what I saw in my sessions. This is what I've carried. This is what I'm carrying now. This is what I bring to my children and to your children. And that is the vision that what we are doing is profoundly significant. And it's important for every individual to reach as deeply as possible and as high as possible and to manifest the noblest intent possible. If the future were moving in the same way as the past, if we were using linear understanding of history, we might say the forces arrayed against us are overwhelming. It's just too much. The individual can't do anything. We're just going to be swallowed by these environmental processes. But that's not what I saw in my sessions. What I saw in my sessions is that as the suffering increases, the entire psychic field of humanity, the collective unconscious, the collective psyche is going to be increasingly pressurized. It's going to be shoved into what physicists call nonlinear conditions or far from equilibrium conditions. And in far from equilibrium conditions, individual perturbations produce large changes, large outcomes, which means that as we enter deeper into our crisis of history, individuals can have a larger and larger share, an impact on the outcome, on how this crisis will manifest. So I think it's a time of individual empowerment to facilitate deep cultural, profound social transformation. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Another amazing answer. Again, I highly, highly recommend this book. It's so detailed. Just an amazing work. And we're almost at the end of our time with you, Chris. And again, many thanks for being with us today and presenting on our platform. And just as a note to everyone, everyone here is not being paid. We're all volunteers. Chris is here for the love of the work. So is David and Teresa. All of us are. If you find any of our content valuable and you're able to donate, we would much appreciate it.